I'm Eli Clifton, Senior Advisor at the Quincy Institute and Investigative Journalist at Large at Responsible Statecraft. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual panel. We are looking forward to an excellent discussion with our panelists about nuclear war and the impact of the 1983 broadcast of The Day After, a film which raised global awareness of what a nuclear conflict could unleash on humanity. Unfortunately, the time could not be more pressing for this conversation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its nuclear threats against the United States and NATO have made nuclear war a top-of-mind issue for Americans once again. Nearly 70% of Americans now worry about a nuclear attack, a level of concern unparalleled since the Cold War. Now, perhaps more than ever, is the time to look back on one of the most impactful cultural moments that opened the eyes of a generation to the threat of nuclear annihilation: the airing of ABC's made-for-television film, The Day After. The broadcast nearly 40 years ago was a television event watched by more than 100 million Americans. Ronald Reagan credited the film with changing his mind on U.S. policies about nuclear war and influenced his decision to pursue nuclear negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev, leading to the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. But first, for more background, let's take a quick look at a preview of television event, a new documentary about the making and legacy of The Day After. This clip features interviews with former ABC President Brandon Stoddard, Director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency under Ronald Reagan, Kenneth Edelman, and The Day After's director, Nicholas Meyer.
We want to live! We want to live!
I am a human being who happens to care what happens to this earth.
As I've seen the people on TV, it's felt like they were kind of fanatical with their protests and different things. And now I see where they're coming from. I understand more.
I want the liberals to realize that this is not their special area of concern, that it's everybody's concern.
There were conferences all over the place, all over the country, went on for weeks.
The Day After has now become a classroom topic across the country.
The adults who aren't taking the responsibility are threatening our lives.
There's no way you can survive.
It was distributed theatrically and went to 35 countries and 17 languages.
Фильм известного американского режиссера Николаса Майера.
The first American film ever broadcast in Russia. I said, when you show it in Russia, you hand carry film to the station and you sit there the entire time because I don't want anybody touching that film.
Мы надеемся, что показанное в этом фильме подтолкнет народы Земли к тому, чтобы найти способ избежать этого дня. Такими словами заканчивается фильм на следующий день.
I vastly underestimated the importance of The Day After. I could not believe any movie could have a following like that and a reception like it did.
I was thinking that, oh yes, I could unseat Ronald Reagan if I just made a movie showing what nuclear war was. And of course I didn't succeed in doing that, but I succeeded in something weirder.
To preserve our civilization in this modern age, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
Ronald Reagan says in his memoir that the day after left him upset and depressed.
So I think this film is important because it led to something else. It led to the biggest decline in nuclear weapons in history.
Reagan eventually went to Reykjavik, met with Gorbachev, and signed the Intermediate Range Weapons Treaty.
On our side, our entire complement of Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles, with some 400 deployed warheads, will all be destroyed.
I can only tell you that we have both agreed that talking to each other instead of about each other is the way to keep out of trouble.
The Day After was an important thing, and people realize in retrospect just how important it was. Certainly the most valuable thing I've gotten to do with my life to date.
Today, the day after, was shown for the first time in Hiroshima. It was seen by some who were there on the real day after.
Yes, the movie did bring back painful memories, but she's pleased that this movie was made. It could carry on her attempts to warn others, if they listen.
Today we are joined by Jeff Daniels, director of the documentary television event, Katrina vanden Heuvel, publisher of The Nation, and Sharon K. Weiner, nuclear weapons expert and professor at American University. Our panel is moderated by Nausicaa Renner, Washington editor of The Intercept. I'll now turn it over to you, Nausicaa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Eli, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining me for this important conversation. I'm glad to be taking my Washington politics hat off for a second and thinking about how these issues really affect all of us. Just a small programming note, at the end, about 45 minutes in, we're going to have a 15-minute Q&A. So if you're watching live on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, please drop your questions in the chat or in the thread, and we'll be watching for them and can queue them up. I wanted to start with a little anecdote. A few days ago, I live in the suburbs of DC, and we have a very involved community and a very involved email listserv. And somebody sent an email with the subject line, "Nuclear weapons targeting our area." And they had reproduced a map, I think it was produced on nuclearwarsimulator.com, that showed how our neighborhood would be affected when over 1,000 ICBMs from Russia or China or wherever landed on targets in DC. And it was a striking and a terrifying map. Our neighborhood would result in 95% death, it seemed, from the blast or radiation effects. And I responded to my neighbor and I thanked him for posting it. And no one else responded except for one person who said, "I don't think our neighborhood should be posting this." And I asked her why, and she said, "Don't we already have enough to be terrified of?" Which is all to say that I think nobody wants to be thinking about how nuclear war would affect their personal lives and their local areas. But I do think it is on a lot of people's minds, especially now. And the striking thing about the day after is that it seems like nobody wanted to be thinking about it then either. Or, well, there were movements, but, for many Americans, it was not top of mind. So, Jeff, your incredible documentary, how in the world did the day after get made, and how did it get 100 million viewers? And what drew you to make a movie about it?
I think that's a great anecdote to start with, because it's absolutely true. I mean, who in their right mind would want to talk about nuclear war for more than a minute? It takes a certain kind of person, and I think this is why it's important to look at the contribution that artists can make in trying to address these vast global issues, these indigestible issues that we just rather not think about. It takes artists to try and imagine the unimaginable and turn it into, in the case of the day after, prime time family viewing, so that you're able to confront these issues on a personal level, on an emotional level, so that you're better able to mix that in with the political understanding, or say the military understanding in this case of nuclear war. So I think that's something that's quite important to me as a documentary filmmaker. How do I get people to pay attention to the things that I feel are important to them, but that they may just rather put aside because you have so many other worries going on? And we talk about this in the film. You have your daily life, your day-to-day activities that are hard enough. Why bother thinking about something as vast and unimaginable as nuclear war? So that sort of started me on the road to look at how I can revisit this period from my childhood. I was 5 years old when the day after came out, And my entire family piled into my grandparents' basement in Flushing, Queens to watch The Day After. And they had the sense to put me to bed before that iconic bombing sequence. But I got the picture. These people I was being introduced to in Kansas, in the middle of America, were about to die a slow, gruesome death. And so, of course, it hit me later in life. I remembered it and just thought, as a filmmaker, how did a film like this get made? And that's when I went on quite an incredible journey, trying to speak with all the people who were behind it.
Can you tell us a little bit about the media environment that allowed it to go on primetime in 1983?
Certainly. One of the more interesting parts of the story for me was that ABC, the ABC network, at that time the most watched network in America, a very family-friendly network, the maker of Happy Days and The Love Boat, they were just about to be bought by Disney. What would make a network like this throw nuclear war on the American living room? So I think that's really where the story of people like Brandon Stoddard, who was the head of ABC Entertainment at that time, that's where he comes into the picture. And I think it really took certain people of influence at ABC willing to take a chance on a subject that they first and foremost thought would really get some incredible ratings. But then on the other side, something that was meaningful, something that gave their network integrity, and something that they were willing to take a chance on, even if the sponsors ended up leaving, which is what happens with The Day After. And in there, you then get the story of creatives like Nicholas Meyer and other producers like Stephanie Austin, who get on board and end up finally able to make something that speaks to their values that could also reach a broad audience. And I think that's what created the magic and the influence, the great influence of this TV movie, The Day After, even up to today.
And Katrina, to bring you in, what context did it land in? Like, what were the American people feeling and doing about the possibility of nuclear war?
So I want to back up. First of all, it's a terrific documentary and important to see. It's hard to do justice just with a few clips. But 1982, June 12th, 1982, there were 1 million people in Central Park protesting against nuclear weapons. It was the disarmament conference in New York City at the United Nations. 1 million people, to this day, the largest political demonstration in our country's history. I think that says a lot, because there is denialism today, there was then, but to bring that number of people, and there was a legacy. The legacy was The Day After, which was in that context. The legacy was also in a very Cold War context. I think you had KAL 007, if people remember that. You had bad relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. But then it moved into a period where in 1985, Gorbachev came to power, March 5, 1985. This summit in Geneva in November 85 was where the two leaders spoke of a nuclear war must never be fought, can never be won. And in that context, things like The Day After, which, by the way, I know the Soviet commentator, Russian commentator, who's in the film, Vladimir Molchanov. He wept after seeing The Day After. It is known that Gorbachev and members of the high leadership saw the film. And there was an understanding through that film and through protests around the world that the time had come to shift. And Gorbachev was someone beyond his time, visionary. And Reagan, the idea that Reagan shifted his mind because of the arms buildup, or that Gorbachev and the Soviet Union because of the arms buildup. No, it was two leaders, and it was protests, and it was people and people power and movements. That in 1987, the two leaders, after the summit in 85, signed the International Nuclear INF Treaty, which for the first time abolished an entire class of nuclear weapons. And the last thing I'll say is today we live with no arms agreements with the exception of a very weak one. The entire infrastructure of nuclear weapons agreements has been shredded, beginning in 2002 with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. There's some hope with a treaty to abolish for the prevention of nuclear weapons, and there's a lot of young energy around that. But the context in '83 was really, I would say, Ken Edelman, who's in the film, sums it up quite well. I mean, they were freaked out in the Reagan White House, and he was freaked out seeing 1 million people, but then seeing this film and what it might mean. Last thing I'll say, there was a panel after the day after with Henry Kissinger, McNamara, Brent Scowcroft, Elie Wiesel, Carl Sagan, and I'm forgetting someone. Oh, William Buckley, who said the film, and this was a view by many, was defeatist because it would lead people to understand that nuclear weapons couldn't secure them, and it would make everyone say, we don't want them anymore. And so the fight was on to make sure people didn't feel that way. So there's always a backlash to a powerful statement like the day after.
Yes, and was it Henry Kissinger who said, I don't think that we should be transmitting a politics of fear? I can't remember the exact quote, but that was also
Henry
so striking.
Kissinger is a war criminal, but unfortunately he has signed on to along with 4 Men of the Apocalypse, to the abolition of nuclear weapons for different principles than those meeting in Vienna next week. But there was a lot of talk about a nuclear war could be waged. There's a reason people said it should never be fought and could never be won. There was a belief it could.
So apart from the Cold War ending, why do you think that nuclear war sort of fell out of the public consciousness as a possibility? I mean, I'm thinking now about how the Biden administration is getting ready to redo the nuclear arsenal. And I'm just wondering, I mean, maybe this is sort of an intangible
I think it's back
question,
on people's
but
minds.
what's changed?
No, I think it's back on people's minds. I think there was a recent AP poll last month showing 8 of 10 people are now worried about nuclear weapons because of the fight, the war, the barbaric war in Ukraine, and the fear that if it escalates, which is very possible between Russia's statements and the normalization and loose talk on our TV sets about, small tactical low yield weapon. Oh, battlefield. That's very scary. I know Sharon knows more about it. But I do think it's back on people's minds, and I think it's important that we, get rid of nuclear silos and get rid of silos so that there's a line between the militarization of our cities, of our gun policy, of, policing, and an awareness in communities that there is a link in a way to the militarization of our mindset, which is part of nuclear weapons. So I do think there's a sense of more connection that could lead to real movement. And nuclear weapons are the ultimate violence. And the connection to climate. Nuclear winter, Carl Sagan was talking about it back then. So making those connections with movements that have a vibrancy, I think, is hopeful and powerful.
And Sharon, I want to bring you in. There's a strain in the movie, to back up a little bit, there's a strain in the movie about the director really feeling that it was necessary to show graphic images of people's skin peeling off, of people being vaporized, of blood. And there was a real fight with the network about that. I think this is part of a perpetual debate that we have about what showing this kind of image does for people when they see it, if it sort of inures them to what's going on, or if it really prompts a visceral response. And, I'm wondering about your work, if you could describe your work in VR, which I know is about the decision-making behind a nuclear war, but just the idea behind providing people with an experience of what it's like to be in this situation and the importance of doing that.
Sure. So I think it's important to remember that the nuclear age has been an age where lots of people have tried to get other people to pay attention to the danger of nuclear weapons. I mean, I'm thinking of the day after. I grew up downwind of an ICBM field in Missouri, and we knew that if there was ever a nuclear war, our chances of survival were close to zero. But not everybody has that lived experience of growing up on a farm downwind from an ICBM field. But there have been, scientists who have tried to use facts to get people to pay attention, artists who have used paintings. I mean, Jackson Pollock said you couldn't paint in the style of the Renaissance once you knew about nuclear weapons. People have written fictional books. They've created atomic monsters, movies on TV, trying to use new technology to connect with people and make them realize that even if they're not thinking about nuclear weapons, there are always nuclear dangers in the background, dangers of accident, misperception, and that money's being spent on them in the name of the people who aren't thinking about them. And so myself and my colleague, Moritz Kut, decided to use virtual reality because in contrast to paintings or TV, two-dimensional objects are flat on the screen that invite you to view something. When you're sitting in virtual reality, your mind actually thinks you're present in another situation. And so what we're trying to do is to invite people to live the experience of actually having to make a decision in probably 15 minutes or less, where you don't have complete information about what the situation is, but the consequences are astronomically high. And so it's not to view that, it's not to read about it, it's to actually experience it. So that's why we chose virtual reality as a technology to do this.
And I think that we have a brief clip of a VR sequence, and then maybe you could explain exactly what it's showing.
Sure. Let me just start off by saying watching VR on a TV screen is really different from experiencing it in the headset.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
Mr. President, please come in. There's a chair for you here at the table.
Please focus on the task at hand. We have incoming nuclear weapons.
So what we've basically done is take current U.S. nuclear strategy and force structure and script it into what would likely happen in a nuclear crisis. And so in this particular nuclear crisis, you're sworn in as president of the United States, you're enjoying the feel of the resolute desk in the Oval Office, and just about the time you get comfortable, an alarm goes off, you're evacuated to a secure facility, and you can ask any question you want. You can call up advisors, you can ask for information. It's an interactive experience, but it's also scripted according to the time it would take ICBMs to fly to the United States and destroy US ICBM silos. And so the tension in the experience is, what's your value? Do you save the ICBMs by launching them? Or do you save people by riding out and waiting to make sure that it's not a mistake?
And what seems striking is that the information environment, even if you're able to ask questions, the pressure on you, it's never a perfect environment in which you're being asked to make this decision, right?
Right. It's not even close to a perfect environment. And what we also know from behavioral psychology and economics or even advertising is, I mean, how many people have bought something that later they thought they really didn't need to buy? The same phenomenon is going to apply to a president in a nuclear crisis. There are all of these studies showing that in a crisis, we make really bad decisions, and that those decisions depend on not the facts of the situation, but whether or not we had just had a fight with a family member, maybe whether it's a hot or a cold day, whether or not we feel we're happy or sad, all kinds of things that you could never control for. The only thing you can control for is the damage that would result. And thankfully, we know the answer to that question. That's to get rid of the nuclear weapons.
There's a very good book called Command and Control. about what we've escaped, the accidents. And it's worth reading, and it's also worth thinking because the nuclear protest in Central Park was also linked to nuclear power. And we've seen in a different way Chernobyl, we've seen Indian Point, we've seen in our country, 3 Mile Island, those scenarios, Sharon, that you described, where people have to make really fast decisions. It's under crisis atmosphere. So it's not my favorite person, but Robert McNamara, who was in that panel afterwards, once that was asked later in life how we escaped a nuclear war, and he said, luck, 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 like something.
I think it's also important to consider, people are also paying attention now to nuclear weapons because of concerns about Ukraine and the threats that Russia has made. Even the notion that you would use one small nuclear weapon, I think it's important to also consider what Strategic Command says when they run war games for just such scenarios. And they say they always end badly, and badly as in they end in massive thermonuclear war. So there are also presumptions we make about the ability to control these things, which are theoretical presumptions that are divorced from reality.
One thing that I thought was amazing about the movie was that it demonstrated how they were trying to walk this line of being able to tell the truth about what would happen in a nuclear war without sending people into a total panic attack. And so there was this test. Maybe, Jeff, you could describe a little bit more about whether something made you avert your eyes.
Yeah, certainly. I found that fascinating, this discussion of passionate artists trying to really show people the effects of a nuclear war based on the intense research that they did in making The Day After. They used a lot of government information on what-if scenarios that led the writer, Ed Hume, to use Lawrence, Kansas, a college town in the middle of America, as an example. This was a similar example used in what-if scenarios that were written up during the Carter administration. So trying to be as factually accurate as they could be in order to instill a sense of integrity, but also to really just show people what it would be like was something that the artists were trying to push. But they were pushing against network executives who understood their audience. They understood what they could take, or their job was to be risk averse so that they could ensure that people would keep watching that television. And so what you get is this great dramatic story of two sides trying to compromise and speak with each other in order to create something that was successful. Maybe trying to show the brutal realities, the gruesome realities of the effects of nuclear radiation isn't exactly what you need. Maybe you need a sense of that. And I think that's what artists are able to do quite well. They're able to try and build an emotional understanding of these very complicated, indigestible subjects. And so that's what you get with The Day After. And while Stephanie Austin, one of the producers, mentioned, I didn't get to really get to that realism I was hoping for, but because we compromised, we were able to get 100 million people in the US alone to watch the same thing at the same time and talk about nuclear war in a way that the country as a whole hadn't. And that's what really allowed this piece of art to influence others who were in positions of power to do something about it.
Could I ask Jeff a quick question relating to why did you set it in Lawrence, Kansas? And it relates in a way to the mission of Quincy, which is kind of transpartisan. In the scenes at the dinner table at the beginning, people are saying this is not their issue. I looked at the protesters and didn't understand what they were up to, but now I do. I'm just wondering if there was an intent in the ABC, the community of filmmakers, to make it outreaching. And there's no sense of the adversary.
Absolutely. I think that was top of mind from the very beginning. Brandon Stoddard, the head of ABC Entertainment at that time, who eventually became president of ABC after the success of The Day After, he said, this is a hot button topic in the US. This is an issue that is at the center of a polarized country in Reagan's America. We need to make sure that we don't talk about who pressed that button. It's not about who the aggressor was. It's about what life would be like in the event of a nuclear war. And so I think that's why they felt, let's choose a place that's literally at the center of the United States, the continental United States, Lawrence, Kansas, an incredible city which itself has an amazing history. As Kansas was anti-slave during the Civil War. It had been raised by people from Missouri who were pro-slavery just before the Civil War and had been burnt down many times, only to rise again. It has an incredible history, Lawrence, Kansas, and it's I think it represents the middle of America during a very polarized time. And what better place to show people of various minds sharing this horrible experience so that America too could come together despite their differences and just talk about what they saw and what they experienced through this television movie. So that I think it was important for me to see that in Trump's America, that there was a time when we could come together. We don't have to agree with each other. We should be talking with each other, though, instead of talking about each other, which is what Reagan and Gorbachev, luckily, were able to do. And that created some quite meaningful change.
And 100 million people is an audience that, to me, is basically unthinkable in the current context, where nobody is sitting down at the same moment to watch anything anymore. The only comparison that I can think of is Don't Look Up, which similarly sort of took on an apocalyptic scenario and was very widely watched on Netflix. I won't cite any statistics because I'm going to get them wrong, but it also prompted a moment of considering climate change. I'm wondering, if any of you have thoughts on that movie or on other touchstones that we can think about that may have had a similar impact.
I'd love to know what Sharon thinks about this.
So forgive me being the academic. I'm going to cite a piece of literature. So we tend to think that the things that we should worry about, that we look out in the world, like climate change, that we know that it's real and that rationally people should be concerned about it. The same for nuclear war, the same for worrying about pandemics, COVID. But there's this great book called Culture and Risk by a sociologist named Mary Douglas. And she says it's not enough. It's not about that you know the facts about what worries you. It's an expression of the other things that you feel challenge you in your surroundings and in your culture. So it's not about rationally weighing the worst danger out there and doing something about it. It's about how it resonates culturally with other things that may not be the worst danger out there, but which impact you personally. So The Day After matters because so many people were previously concerned about Reagan's warmongering. I mean, we all remember we probably all don't remember, some of us do, him telling the fake joke about we've outlawed the Soviet Union, we'll begin bombing in 5 minutes. I mean, even without nuclear war, people were concerned about Reagan and his policies. The same Don't Look Up, even without that movie, people are concerned about collective action and the common good, because one of the things that I think both COVID and the Trump years taught us is that your neighbor may not care about your well-being. And I think that's a significant change in American culture.
Could I say something for Dr. Strangelove? It is still, it endures. I mean, there's a reason people watch it every year, and there's a sense that it's such a grim subject that satire works. I did know Terry Southern a little, and he stopped writing much around the Rumsfeld years because he said that the reality had outpaced satire. But that movie whether it's, from the small things which are real, like fluoride in the water, fluoridation of the water, but that those images, and no war in the war room. Satire is important anyway, but I do think what's been a thread through so much is fear. Fear has been a thread through how we make foreign policy, how we engage with the world, and how it motivates people to take action or not. The denial piece, I think, is really real.
Well, and you were talking about events that prompted people to action. So I was born in 1963. So people a year younger than me who lived in the lower 48 states were all exposed to some level of fallout from US nuclear testing. And it was in the 1960s that mothers started sending in their kids' baby teeth because they had deposits of strontium-90 in them from nuclear testing. And it was that fear that nuclear weapons were immediate and personal, that they were in your children's baby teeth, that then led to the Partial Test Ban Treaty. That people said, enough. We can't be passive about something that's affecting our children in this way, and they were prompted to action. So I think there's a sense
there's at least one person on this call was involved in that campaign. And the Women's International League for Peace, but mothers, you're right, mothers playing a role, whether it's the milk or the teeth, but it did lead, you're right, to the comprehensive, and maybe to the American University speech, of 63, which is important.
The American University speech of 63, but there was also a similar Obama speech many years later. But it's a testament to the change of American politics and almost the domestic politicization of nuclear issues, that the nuclear modernization program started by Obama is essentially the same program as Donald Trump endorsed and the same program endorsed by Joseph Biden.
I have this quote
Sharon said something important about that. Sharon said she was raised near an ICBM silo. There are protests now, people living near ICBM silos, and some of it is very tough because, as economic development in 4 or 5 states in this country are laced through the big defense companies. They built the infrastructure in the state, so it's jobs too, which has played a role, but
all of which disappear if those weapons are ever used.
I have this quote I pulled out from 2 experts on the Cuban Missile Crisis, James Blight and Janet Lang. They say, most of the time, most people give this issue no thought, no resources, and know next to nothing about the level of threat that might careen the world once again into some shocking, unexpected crisis that spins out of control toward Armageddon. Are we that dumb, that ignorant, that much in denial? And what I'm hearing is no. It's just that, especially people who work in the media and work in culture need to take advantage of the moments that we are thinking about it to sort of capitalize on that and put things in front of people that help them really understand and connect it with their own experience. Jeff,
I think that, it really is important. I think this was one of the main reasons for why it was important for me to document this period in 1983, when the day after came out, and hit a generation of people my age and a bit older, so that they were able to understand this issue emotionally. Children are quite empathetic, and they're very much in connection with that part of themselves, and they feel that it has validity at a time when they're starting to speak with adults and learn more about the world around them. I think what the day after was able to provide was some quite intense classroom discussions about the effects of nuclear war, so that it became something that wasn't about keywords, megaton, and all these terms that in themselves seem meaningless. But when you actually see the effect that they can have on you personally, on your family, on your community, that's when you start to understand the value of seeing these issues emotionally and allowing that to carry equal weight to other understandings, which are also necessary. And so I grew up with this generation of school children who were educated on the effects of a nuclear war. And now when they hear this coming back and encounter children the same age who are thinking, what is this thing, nuclear war? And it seems like it's something I've played with on video games or I've heard about in some way, but they have the same questions now that politicians are using nuclear weapons as saber rattling and as threats. Luckily, I think we have an entire generation raised to understand the reality of nuclear war, how horrible it is, and who are reacting against it. So this is why we need to support artists who imagine the unimaginable, so that we're able to better understand just how completely psychotic the idea of a weapon of mass destruction like a nuclear weapon is.
I'm seeing that some YouTube viewers have dropped other films in the chat, including Avatar as a climate metaphor, Threads. I'm not familiar with all of these, so if you want to jump in and say anything about them.
I was thinking of another documentary, Atomic Cafe. You remember? I mean, the idea of duck and cover. Someone sent me a photograph today of a classroom in Texas where they're asked to duck and cover from active shooters with blankets over them. And that film was so frightening in its own cheery, chirpy use of government video way. So I raised that as one.
Oh, so let me, if I may add, so there's a film called The House in the Middle, which you can Google. So it's about protecting the house in the middle survives nuclear war. This was made in the 1950s. And if you think about 1950s America, you realize the sexist and racist overtones, which are implied by this film, that you have to be the white family where mom doesn't work and that lives in the suburbs to survive nuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
I will say with all due respect to all due respect to our media, not The Intercept and not The Nation, and a lot of journalists these days have been acting as combatants in a battle, as sort of seeking to know when we're going to escalate with more weapons. And there's a mindset about focusing on the military piece of things as opposed to what many perceive as boring, like diplomacy or resolution through talk. But one thing I'll say is the little I know, and Sharon may know more, or others, there are no discussions. There are no lines now between, for example, the United States and Russia. When there were lower level talks, even at a time of higher Cold War, this is hot war, it was very important. And no communication is very, very scary.
No, I agree. It's always interesting that as the tension goes up, the U.S. government response is to talk less to the people that you're worried about.
And before we turn to audience questions, I want to hammer on the journalism part of it because it's such a big issue for me and for The Intercept that yes, many journalists from mainstream outlets were sort of belligerently asking Jen Psaki, like, well, what if there's a no-fly? Like, when are we going to impose a no-fly zone? Which is basically asking, when is nuclear war going to start? And there were no questions about off-ramps for Putin. There were no questions about how we're advocating for that or how we're advocating for deterrence. And it has been a very disappointing thing as somebody in DC media to see that play out again.
If I could just add, today there was someone today who was added to the list, had to say he was not pro Putin because he was raising diplomatic possibilities, which that's the Pope. The Pope. He literally had to reply, I'm simply discussing possibilities for peace. The war in Ukraine is brutal, the Russian invasion. And someone said, are you pro-Putin? And he said, I am not.
Somewhat chilling. So Jeff, before we turn to audience questions, do you want to give a quick plug for where people can watch this amazing documentary that we've been playing up?
Certainly, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm proud to say that the film will be available online on Amazon, on Apple Plus, iTunes, anywhere where you can stream films on July 5th. That's the date when television events will be available. And I welcome you all to watch it and to follow the film's Twitter page @television events, so that you can tell me what you thought of it. Tell us and the team who made it how it affected you, what it reminded you of, and continue the conversation. So yes, July 5th is when television events will be available online.
Thank you. So our first question is a question that I love because it's about one aspect of your documentary is that it really shows how they made the movie. I mean, it's an amazing movie about nuclear policy, but it's also and about nuclear war, but it's also about movie process and like what it's like to try to visually show something that has only actually happened on Earth twice. So a member of the YouTube audience asks, I would like to know about how the imagery of the mushroom clouds was done. The design looks very different to many of your films, almost like a jellyfish rising up. Why were, but yeah, I'll leave it there.
Oh man, you're gonna have to watch the film. Well, I can give away that they were racking their brains trying to find a way to visualize the mushroom cloud. This was a time when computer animation was very rudimentary, and they were trying to make it look real on a very small budget. One day, Stephanie Austin, who later went on to produce a lot of James Cameron's films, including Terminator 2, which is known for its iconic nuclear blast scene in the playgrounds. That was all Stephanie Austin because of the work that she did trying to make The Day After so real. Terminator 2, I think, was her chance to really do an incredible job on that. But they noticed she was racking her brain trying to figure out how do I make this mushroom cloud, and she was having lunch in the cafeteria at ABC, and she noticed someone putting milk in their iced tea, and the cloud just went down, and then it spread up, and exactly like a mushroom cloud. So they filmed it and then just flipped it, and that is exactly how they made the mushroom cloud in The Day After.
So cool. Katrina, a question for you.
I was going to say, I think in the filmmaking process, there were two other titles. The Day After emerged, right? But it was like Silence in Heaven or Book of Revelation.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if it was? Anyway.
Silence in Heaven, you know, in the movie, the co-producers, or I forget who exactly, they kind of tear apart that name, but I thought it was a beautiful name that we're sort of being abandoned by heaven, and it's I think it's from the Book of Revelations, and what is it, that there will be silence in heaven for 30 minutes, which is the length of time. Sorry, I'm just quoting the movie now. It's the length of time that it takes for an ICBM roughly to go across the world.
And there's no response from God on what the acts of humans do. We're in this, we're on our own when it comes to stuff like that. So I thought it was a very
I don't think the big wigs at ABC or Disney were going for it. I don't see it as the ABC movie of the week, but it could be. It could be.
Katrina, a question for you. You mentioned that Gorbachev had seen the movie. Do you think that Putin has seen it? Totally speculative.
You know, it was a different time. I mean, I don't know. My late husband and I got to know and know Gorbachev well, but we've never met Putin. It may be that people around him, and maybe he should be, someone should send the link with him. But I will say, and this is not about Putin, but a country that experienced 27 million people dead in World War II understands brutality, and what we're witnessing now on our TV sets. I was about to say, so much of our media coverage of war has been drone war, or like videoization of war. We cannot look at war again, the barbaric scenes out of Ukraine. And my view, to pick up on what you asked Sharon about photos, looking at photos, my sense is we should have no more wars, but if we do, we should see them as we're seeing Ukraine. I mean, this is barbarism, and it's not a drone game, and it's not distant. So I think in that sense, the more people see, I know that's hard to say, but it's obviously sensitivities, young kids, but still, it's important to see.
I just a note on whether Putin watched the day after. When Gorbachev saw the film, he insisted that it screen on public television, in the only television available in the Soviet Union. And this was in 1987. It was the first American TV movie to be shown on Soviet television. And I heard reports of up to 200 million people in the Soviet Union watching the day after when it came out. So I'd say it's highly likely that Putin, if he didn't watch it, he would have at least heard about it and talked about it with people. But sometimes these things don't really change minds, but the hope is that they discuss them in some way and hear other people out on what they experienced when they were watching this visualization of the effects of a nuclear war.
Just briefly, I knew the man who introduced it in your film, the man who, this Russian, Vladimir Molchanov, and he wept after seeing it. For better, he later became ambassador to the Netherlands, but the impact on.
I was just going to add, so let's say Putin did watch this movie. We assume Biden watched it, but Putin watched it. He understands very clearly what the risk is, and we're seeing that right now because this is nuclear strategy in action. It is throwing around dangerous threats in a game of brinksmanship because you can't win another way, so you're trying to convince the other person not to do this horrible thing in the knowledge that you can't completely control it. So that this is nuclear strategy in action, is throwing around threats, in some cases casually, to do this. And I'll stop there. I won't stop. Just briefly, there is also an argument that Putin wasn't threatening nuclear war, that he was making a statement about changing their preparation strategy. And that part of the problem is the U.S. response to suddenly, as you were mentioning, the media always wanting to know, well, when's the nuclear threat going to happen? When, what are the chances of this? As if it's a costless game to be curious about when nuclear war might start.
Just one more question before we wrap up, I think. And if you have final thoughts, you can weave them in. So one of our viewers made a connection, got to something that we haven't really touched on, which is nuclear, the sort of glorification of nuclear war in movies, pointing out that in 1994, I don't know, I haven't seen this movie, so others will have to speak to it. True Lies described a nuclear bomb as showtime. Do you think that that's a problem and pervasive? I can't think of so many examples, but
Yeah, the sum of all fears. I can say that Nicholas Meyer was actively trying to work against this. He called it disaster porn, something that was quite common, especially among television movies at this time. And he said, I felt it was more important to veer more towards the public service announcement aspects of this. Yes, Jason Robards was in the film, but other than that, most of the other people involved, Amy Madigan and Steve Guttenberg, they were not very well known at this time. He didn't want famous actors. He didn't want great music. There was sparse music in the film, if you can remember. That he didn't want great cinematography or special effects. He just wanted people to sit with the reality of what it would be like to experience a nuclear war. And so I think that's what separates The Day After from a number of other films that may have really pushed the envelope to kind of lean into the entertainment value of how horrific it is. And in that way, missing the point of what you're trying to sit with, something that you would never want to experience yourself, and something that shouldn't necessarily have entertainment value, but something that's more of a conversation point. And so in that way, I feel that The Day After is uniquely successful in achieving that aim of galvanizing a nation through this shared experience to talk about something that they would rather not.
And I should say that there are countless movies that glorify the U.S. military. So
yeah, On the Beach. But my sister knows the young girl who was in The Day After, the daughter in Lawrence, Kansas, who was in the shelter, and that she participated willingly, but she's still traumatized in ways by just the filming of the film.
Absolutely,
young,
it was. Yeah, I felt she represented so much, not just an actor. It was her first and only acting experience, but she was a child in Reagan's America, and she was a local of Lawrence, Kansas. She was able to speak to so much. She woke up every day for a month, seeing her entire town looking like a post-apocalyptic wasteland. That affected her, and she talked to me when I was trying to get her involved in the film. She said, when I moved to New York, just before 9/11, when that day happened, I was in a supermarket and there was a rush on everything. And immediately I was back in the filming of The Day After. It brought everything back. And I really needed to take a moment, so it's, we're all quite affected by this experience. And I think that, Ellen Moore, this child actor, really spoke to what a lot of us were going through to a lesser degree. And it's important to hear these stories of how children are affected by the trauma that we're inflicting on them, especially when we don't take seriously how horrific some of the events that are going on now, like gun violence in schools, actually is. We need to listen to children on what they're feeling about this so that we can remind ourselves of how absolutely absurd and psychotic it is that we allow it to continue.
Well, I think we have to end it there. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation. I'll kick it back to Eli.
Yeah.
Thank you to Sharon Weiner, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, Jeff Daniels, and Nausicaa Renner for moderating, and all of you who have tuned in today. Please consider joining the Quincy Institute's upcoming events. On June 16th, we'll explore the factors behind overspending at the Pentagon. On June 21st, we're hosting a discussion on whether Al-Qaeda poses a present threat to the United States. And on June 22nd, we're producing a webinar on the new crop of conservatives challenging hawkish GOP orthodoxy on Ukraine in the wake of Trump. You can register for all of these events at quincyinst.org/events. This event was co-sponsored by the Quincy Institute, The Intercept, and The Nation. Please consider signing up to their respective newsletters and donating to support all three important organizations. You can do so at their respective websites, thenation.com, quincyinst.org, and theintercept.com/donate. Thank you all.